Grow your practice, grow your wealth, grow your impact. Find out how to spend less time in the dental chair and more time on the things you love.
Welcome back to the Dental Wealth Podcast. Glad to have you back. Glad to have you watching and listening. You know, every week I look at the numbers keep going up. So continue watching and sharing and liking. This is a great time for me able to, get some thoughts out, get some content over to you. What a great thing. I mean, the greatest thing about podcasts is we can listen to them in the car. We can watch them when we have time, and it allows us to grow and develop in a way that makes sense. And so, with these podcasts, I jump around somewhat for a reason, because what I want to do is I want to provide different areas of content, and I don't want to just talk about financial numbers all the time. I want to show you what I see, and what I see from top producers, what I see from dentists that are doing well, what I see from people that are struggling. Looking at using my financial background, my MBA, my years of business experience, and thousands of meetings and all the things. And so what I'm doing for you on this podcast is bringing together in a way for you to skip what would take you decades of your own life to try to collect the data on it. And so I'm glad to have you here. And when you're listening to this, I want you to be tuned in. But just know I'm going to jump around a little bit. But all of these topics, they're relative, and they're all important for you to think about dental wealth. This is a Dental Wealth Podcast. And there's a lot of things that go into being wealthy and in creating a life of wealth, both financially and otherwise. And so today's podcast, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And, I'm a prior Navy guy, so I do my best to not swear very often, but I think I'm labeling this podcast Own Your Shit. and that might offend you. And if it does, maybe you want to just turn it off and you don't. I'm just kidding. Look, I think it's really important for you to understand that the biggest problem, I say problem, by the way, we all do it to some degree. And I want to make it clear. We all, and I've told you before, tell ourselves a story. We have a narrative, and, we live in this uncertain world. So we create these narratives, and those narratives give us a reality we can understand, and they allow us to let ourselves have excuses, and they allow for us to have the existence we have. And I tell you that because I'm always hearing a narrative. When you speak to me, by the way, when you're talking to me, I'm analyzing the narrative you're telling yourself. Because one of the things I've realized is that people have told themselves a story, and I've told you that it caps their success. And I'm going to give you an example, and it might be not the example you expect. So recently, I was in front of a doctor, and this doctor is highly successful, a very highly successful doctor. And so he was speaking to another doctor, and I watched these two doctors communicate. So Dr. A, we'll call him, starts telling Dr. B all the great things that he's doing in his practice, and how he's built this and how he's done that, and how he's got this system and that system. And Dr. B is quiet, and Dr. B sits back, and Dr. B listens, and Dr. B asks a few questions, and Dr. A feels very proud at this moment, right? He's educated about all the systems he has and how great he is. He doesn't realize that Dr. B's net worth is about 4 times what his is. He also doesn't realize that Dr. B's practice is doing 3 times what his is. But he's communicating in a way because he's told himself that he's created this narrative that he is right. He's doing everything right. And he's got all the answers, and he's figured it out. And he's telling this story about all his systems that he's got and how amazing he is. And by the way, I'm not knocking on Dr. A. Certainly, by the way, we all, I think, sometimes need to feed our ego to some degree, feel good about the things we're doing. So I'm not knocking Dr. A at all, by the way. I mean, heck, I think we all find ourselves sometimes being Dr. A, maybe. But to realize that there's this thing where if Dr. A had owned his shit and said, look, will you tell me a little bit about your practice? And instead of talking so much, right? Maybe that's my problem. Sometimes I talk more than I listen sometimes. But if he had asked questions to that doctor, if he had stopped talking about how great he was for a moment and owned his troubles, because by the way, those troubles were pretty deep, and he did not know at the time that Dr. B had the solutions to his problems and knew exactly how to help Dr. A. But Dr. A wanted to talk about how great he was instead of owning his shit and saying, look, this is where I'm struggling. Look, gosh darn it, I'm struggling so much in this area. Do you know, what are you doing in your practice? And I find that little dialogue there interesting because it goes back down to success. Now you have two successful people. Let me make sure I make it clear. Two successful people. But then what ends up happening is that we start to tell ourselves our story and we don't own our stuff and say, look, here's where I'm struggling. And so I always say when I go to dental conventions, like doctors get together like salespeople. I should say we all do it. I mean, that's probably a better way to say it. We all want to feel good about what we're doing. But I'm talking about truly how to become financially wealthy and to truly move the next level. That's what this podcast is about. Like, how do you move the needle? How do you really move the needle in your life? And so I see this dilemma that happens sometimes that caps people's success. And we've all heard the saying, like, they won't get out of their own way. Well, when I look to work with a doctor and when I look to hire a team member, I'm always looking for three things. I want them to be humble. I want them to be hungry. I need someone who wants to work, and I want them to be smart. And I mean emotionally smart, right? They know how to handle things. They can emotionally control themselves. They have emotional intelligence. And so that first part, that humble, is such a key thing, right? It's owning and saying, look, I've got some problems that I might be able to get some help with. And by the way, everybody has problems. We all do. We all have stuff. But what ends up happening is there's this story that we tell ourselves in this narrative. And I'll give you a simple example of what I mean by that. I had someone tell me the other day they were late because they got behind someone slow, and the narrative they created was the reason that they were late for work was because this person was slow, and that was what was causing the problem. And so it's not their fault, right? So it's not their fault that they're late. I'm going to relate this back to your dental practice in a moment, but it was not their fault that they're late. It's not their fault. And I was in the military, and you know what your good excuse for being late was? There wasn't one. You planned ahead. You knew that there was going to be slow drivers on the road. You made sure. You got there 30 minutes early. You did whatever you had to do because it's never anyone else's fault. Speaking of the Navy, I mean, recently they removed, by the way, it was probably about 2 years ago maybe at this point. They removed, I want you to hear me on this. They removed the commander of the Pacific Fleet of the United States. This is the same position, by the way, that was controlling Midway, right? The Battle of Midway. This is World War II. One of the most important positions in the United States military was removed, right? Because some ships started having incidences. Now, he can certainly say, well, I was removed because all these captains didn't know what they were doing. But the truth is, it's his fault. Ultimately, it is. And so what ends up happening is this narrative where, and probably to this day, that admiral still is saying, like, it's not my fault. I got railroaded by a bunch of captains that weren't doing their job. And if they had been doing their job, then I wouldn't have lost my position as the commander of the Pacific Fleet. God, that's a big deal, by the way. It's like a president of the United States has to make that decision. That's a big deal. But how many times do we do the exact same thing in our business? It's not my fault. It's my hygienist's fault. It's my front office person's fault. It's my financial advisor's fault. It's Trump's fault. It's the Democrats' fault. It's this person's fault. And we start to create this narrative in this uncertain world. I wasn't ready for coronavirus because who could be, right? I didn't have enough cash set aside because there was no way I could have anticipated this happening. Well, we all could have anticipated winter. I've been saying it forever. Stuff happens. And so what happens is, and by the way, I want you to take this when you listen to this, and if you're pushing back already, this might be really directed at you right now. If you're pushing back going like, that's not me. No, it is you. It's you. We all do it, by the way. I do it. You do it. We all do it. We all have, but we have to own for a second to say, like, that's why I'm like telling you, you've got to own your stuff. You've got to own it and say, look, the reason my hygienist is not showing up on time is my fault. The reason I'm not financially where I want to be is my fault. The reason why I'm out of shape is my fault. The reason I have a crappy marriage is my fault, or whatever it is. And by the way, take ownership if it's good too, by the way. Maybe it's like, I've got great hygienists because it's my fault, right? I'm the one who got it. But look, because by the way, you can own successes too. I don't want to beat you up. I mean, own successes that you're doing well. I mean, you certainly should also own your successes and the things that are leading you to prosperity and that you're doing well. But you also need a little bit of humbleness and say, look, the reason I'm not where I need to be is because I haven't completely owned that I haven't opened my mindset to what my possibilities are. And so what ends up happening is we create stories, and I've talked about stories before, but it was like not too long ago. I literally was taking notes on something and I wrote, I'm too old for this. I'm too old. And then I was like, Eric, that's a story. It's like, own your shit. That's not true. You just got to go figure out how to make it happen. And I did. So when we look at success, by the way, if you're listening to this podcast, I already know who you are. So let me tell you who listens to this podcast. All right, I'll tell you exactly who you are. You're only two types of people, okay? Because there's literally four types of people. There's what I call the poor me's, and I've told people this before. Poor me's I had a doctor literally telling me about his divorce 10 years after his divorce. Like I've got people telling me the reason that they're struggling, going back down to owning your stuff. I had a guy literally about a year ago tell me that the reason why he's struggling financially is because in 2008, the market went down. I'm like, it's been 12 years. Like, and he didn't want to own his stuff, right? And so when we think about this for a second, like owning your stuff and owning where you're at. So I've got this doctor who's telling me, I have a doctor, going through, people that these tell themselves this story about, like, these are the things that are happening to me. So what are those people? The poor me's, as I was saying, the poor me's is that doctor who says 12 years ago I had an issue. 12 years ago, and that's what's affecting me today. Poor me. And it's fine, by the way, it's always like this compound effect, because those are the people, who I'm talking about. Their dog just got ran over, and they got a flat tire, and their mom's sick, and they've got a headache, and you know what I'm talking about. They always like this doom and gloom follows them. And they're not listening to this podcast, by the way. They're not listening to this podcast. They're not listening to this podcast because they don't have time to listen to this podcast. Because they can't, because all the poor reasons that they don't have the ability to. They can't get the right iPhone. Their signal doesn't work. They're on their way to the office. They don't have good connection. I mean, there's 100 reasons why poor me's will never listen to this podcast. And they'll blame, they will not own any of their stuff, by the way. None of it. They won't own it. It's everybody else's fault. It's everyone else's problem. And they don't own any of their stuff. there's what I say, the people that are help me's, the people that are saying like, I don't know how to do it, Eric, but gosh, I'll do it. Just tell me what to do. They're listening to this podcast. They're listening to this podcast. And in fact, I would say in some ways, they're the people listening to this podcast taking the best notes because they're like, man, I need it. Because they're as humble can be. They're like, look, I will do it, Eric. You just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And they will. And they get results. There's the third type of people that are the leave me's that will, no matter what you tell them to do, they will not do it. They will tell you why they're good to go, why they've got all the answers, and why they've got it all figured out. And no matter what you give them, they won't do it anyhow. They're not listening to this podcast. They've got it all figured out. They don't need a podcast. They've got it all figured out. They've got all the answers. And then there's the transformative people. The transformative people are the ones that listen to 20 of these podcasts. They've got, matter of fact, if you open up their phone right now, they've got 42 dental podcasts in their phone. And if you're listening to this right now, that might be you. Right? You're like, Eric, you're right. I was just going from this one and dental nachos, and I was going through these dental, different podcasts. And I will tell you that of the two types of people, so you're either the help me type, or you're the transformative type, right? You got to get all the answers. So I'm speaking to both of you right now, both types, and saying, at least, and I will tell you this much: the help me's though are a little bit more like they own their stuff a little bit more. The transformer, which I always boast, I always say the transformer are the best people to work with because they can't get enough. They just want to get better and better and better. The problem is sometimes transformative people know they're transformative, and so because they know they're transformative and they're always learning, sometimes they start to feel like they have a lot of the answers, and so they start talking about all the things they're doing, and they stop listening. My encouragement as you listen to this podcast today, and this is a message for you, is my encouragement is that if you want to be, and by the way, I don't know what you want to be, all right? But if you're listening to this podcast, like I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this idea of like, what story am I telling myself and what do I need to own? Like, what do I need to own right now? What am I not doing right now? Where am I struggling right now? Not like, I need you to like literally say to yourself, don't say I've got it. Where are you struggling? Where do you need help? Where could you improve? Where is the best? And I'm talking about, I'm just talking about specific. Don't go looking for a problem. Where right now do you know that you could use some help? And I want you to ask for it. Whether it's through me or somebody else, I want you to figure out those answers. And I want you to own your shit. And I want you to say, Eric, this is where I've messed up. God, if I could just get this figured out. And I want you to own it 100%. You want to talk about dental wealth? You want to talk about really, really, really getting where you want to be? It's owning it. It's saying, hey, even though I'm successful, Elon Musk has to own his stuff, right? Bill Gates has to own his stuff. It doesn't matter who you are. You still got to own your stuff and say, where are the areas that I need the most help? Because in that room that I'm talking about at the beginning of this podcast, the help was right in front of this doctor, but he never asked. We could say maybe he needs a better set of questions, but it was more important at that time to feel better and talk about his successes than ask questions and own it. And instead of talking, he needed to listen because literally the answers were right in front of him. And I sat back and I watched this happen. And I made a comment, and I don't know if it fell on deaf ears or not, but we all need to do that more, don't we? We all need to own our stuff. Where we're struggling, whether it's financially or health or whatever else we're owning. And we can easily blame somebody else or say it's coronavirus's fault or it's our parents' fault or, it's the dental industry's fault. It's dental insurance's fault. It's hygienist's fault. It's my team member's fault. It's my office manager's fault. It's the economy's fault. No, it's not. It's your fault. And when you start owning that, we are all dealt with circumstances. But if you blame the circumstances, if you blame the only thing you got nothing left. And so you got to look at the problems you're struggling with and say, I got to own this. This is me. This is nobody else. And this is going to be hard for some of the people that are really ultra successful, because it's like, I'm already successful. No, I know. That's why I need you to own where you're not. Those are the areas you shore up. Those are the areas you go to work on. Those are the areas you need to focus on. Get a better set of questions, humble yourself, and open up that dialogue. And you'll find out, you'll start to open up conversations that literally you would have never been exposed to before, and they might give you the answers you're searching for. Hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. We'll talk to you soon.